Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I hope you're all doing very well. So in light of the release of Trolls World Tour, I thought it would be a great idea to go through my top 10 Dreamworks films. Now I already have a list of top 10 Pixar films, which I did last year, and you can check that out in my channel right now. But today we're going to be focusing on the unsung hero of animation, that is Dreamworks. Dreamworks is to Pixar what Pepsi is to Coca-Cola, or Burger King to McDonald's, or DC to Marvel. It's definitely been the underdog over the years when you compare it to the animation juggernaut that is Pixar in terms of its box office as well as its awards recognition. Having said that, Dreamworks also hasn't been pulling its punches because it's had some huge hits over the decades. I'm talking of course about Shrek, How to Train Your Dragon, the Madagascar franchise. These have been incredibly successful franchises for the studio. But today I'm going to be talking about my personal favorite top 10 Dreamworks films, and you guys can let me know what your top 10 are down in the comments below. But before we get into the video, be sure to subscribe to my channel so you can catch my new uploads. Alright, without further ado, let's get into my top 10 Dreamworks films. At number 10 we have Madagascar 2. Now, out of the whole Madagascar franchise, I personally think that Madagascar 2 Escape to Africa is the best one. I would also like to give an honourable mention to the Penguins of Madagascar, both the film and the series, because those characters are phenomenal. The Madagascar franchise really did spin off the best, I think, out of all of the franchises in Dreamworks, because those penguins were genius. They were fantastic. But in terms of the main films themselves, I would say that Madagascar 2 is superior to the first film. And as for the third film, listen, okay, this is a good point to mention that when it comes to Dreamworks, I'm not as well versed in these films as I was for Pixar, because when it comes to the Pixar films, I've watched them dozens and dozens of times. There were points in my life where I knew the scripts for all of these films off by heart. But when it comes to the Dreamworks films, whilst I've loved some of them and have watched some of them dozens and dozens of times, those are the ones that will be at the top of the list. The ones that are lower down on the list, vague memories. I'm definitely going to try and remember as much as I can, and I did watch all of the trailers for these films as opposed to rewatching them all, because who has the time? But I did as much research as I could, and hopefully I can remember the contents of these films that I'm recommending to you as best as I can. I'm trying, okay? I'm trying my best here. Anyways, what I do know for sure is that Madagascar 2 has that moto scene, which is just I remember laughing out loud in the cinema so much. Just for that alone, it is the best entry into the Madagascar franchise. But beyond the really funny moments, this film also had some pretty cool character development and character arcs. They very much explored the identities of each of these characters, and the fact that they found themselves in their natural habitats as opposed to being in that zoo was very enlightening for them all in different ways, especially the zebra, who I think had an existential crisis about his true identity as a zebra and the fact that he wasn't as unique as he thought he was. I believe that's his film. Again. Anyways, what makes the Madagascar franchise really shine for me are these characters. They're fantastic, and I think in terms of the franchise as a whole, number 2 shines as the funniest and the most interesting. At number 9, we have The Prince of Egypt. Now, this is a film that I watched as part of my religious education at school, and I had to rewatch it literally yesterday because I was like, can I even remember this film? Oh yeah, of course I remember it, because it's the Book of Exodus, so it's pretty much that. I will say that there are a lot of people who give this film a lot of props for being like a masterpiece. I personally don't see that. I think it's an excellent animated film for sure, but in terms of it being a masterpiece, a masterclass in animation, if you will, I personally just see it as a really good telling of an already pretty popular story. I don't know if you've heard, but Moses is a pretty big deal to billions of people in the world, so this story kind of came ready at Dreamworks' lap. But like I said, the animation is stunning here. It really is. It can't be undersold, especially considering that it came out in '98 and it still holds up. It still looks beautiful. And there's also some beautiful music in this film as well. I believe the score was done by Hans Zimmer, which That's a cheat sheet right there. That's cheating. Of course, if you have Hans Zimmer on your side, you're going to have amazing music. Not to mention the song Miracles, which is a true classic. This was the Can't Stop the Feeling of the 1990s, and it really has stood the test of time. So I definitely think that this is an excellent adaptation of this rather obscure story. I think it did a lot to progress the field of animation, especially in its integration of 3D animation with the 2D, which is a bit more visible now than perhaps it would have been before, but it still is such such a huge deal in the field of animation, especially for the late 90s. And like I said, it still holds up today in 2020, which is pretty impressive. At number 8, we have Monsters vs. Aliens. Now, this is a film that I think is certainly underrated. It often goes under the radar when it comes to DreamWorks films. And this is also another one that I haven't really thought about in a long time. But when I saw the list of DreamWorks films, I was like, oh my God, I used to love that film. It's so funny. I think the characters there are fantastic. I love the way that they integrated real monsters from myths and legends, like the missing link, and then brought in this character called Susan, who's just so mismatched with the rest of the group. But in the end, they really do work together well. Just the general exaggerative characterizations and the humor of this film, I think, really holds up, at least from what I can tell from the trailer. I'm such a fraud. And I think it's a pretty cool idea to have these monsters fighting aliens. It's like the Suicide Squad of the DreamWorks pantheon. But all of these things are just the side dish to the main meal that is this gelatinous blob called Bob. That's voiced by Seth Rogen. I mean, if you're talking about an MVP in a film, I think he's definitely it. At number 7, we have our first Shrek entry in the form of Shrek 2. Now, like I said before, the Shrek franchise is definitely one of DreamWorks' most successful franchises and one of its best ones in my opinion. I will say, spoiler alert for this video, the first Shrek film is not on my list of top 10s just because, have you tried to rewatch the first Shrek film? It's brutal. I mean, I was talking about animation that holds up through the test of time, but this unfortunately does not. It was very much in the early days of 3D animation, and you can tell it's pretty tough to look at. Not to mention, this was like the last Shrek film that I ever watched. I'd gone through 2 through 4 by the time that I watched the first Shrek film, and I wasn't very tied to it as a result. And I think when it comes to these animated films, just like I said with my Pixar list, and really any film, it's so subjective, and it really does depend on when, where, how you were when you watch these films, especially when it comes to films that you've seen in childhood, where you have those particular memories attached to them. But just to make a case for Shrek 2 on its own, I think it's absolutely hilarious. I love the way that it uses the fairy tales and lore to come up with this whole plot and also create these characters that are just completely insane. The character of Prince Charming, like how would you even go about imagining Prince Charming in that way? It is so funny. And then you have the fairy godmother who's just insane and so hellbound on getting her son on the throne. Oh, I love it. The characterizations here are fantastic. The voice work is fantastic, much like in a lot of these DreamWorks films, actually, just to put that out there. The Shrek franchise is really incredible in the way that it created these characters that just stand the test of time. They really stand out in an ocean of animated characters that you just immediately forget about after seeing the film. If I had to give this film any criticisms, it would be that the characters of Donkey and Puss in Boots definitely get sidelined here. They're not quite as important, although they are usually the sidekicks in all of these films. But I think in the other ones, they had at least something interesting to do while Shrek was focusing on his romance with Fiona. And also, side note, I've never been the biggest fan of Fiona to begin with. I very much preferred her in a following film, which I'll mention later on. But in this film, I just think she's a bit annoying, and it's not her fault because she's under a spell, but still, it was so annoying, especially when you know what's really going on, to see her kind of flounder through this whole situation. It's like, get it together, Fiona. All right, at number 6, we have Kung Fu Panda, the first one. What an excellent concept. This is DreamWorks dipping their toe into some Asian mythology whilst giving us these really cool animal characters to get attached to, and I think it works brilliantly. And speaking of voice work, I think Jack Black in the role of Kung Fu Panda is just mwah, one of his best performances ever. And that's not to undersell Jack Black as an actor, but to very much emphasize how excellent this pairing was. And it's funny because he's surrounded by other much more qualified individuals that could be the chosen one, but instead it's him. Destiny foretold it, and therefore we end up following him on his journey to becoming the Kung Fu Panda and defeating evil and blah blah blah. I don't really care about the storyline of this film, but it's mostly the characters and their dynamics I think is really cool, especially the Sensei. I think he's fantastic. He's one of the best characters in any of these films. Like I said before, when it comes to the story of Kung Fu Panda, I don't think it's its strong suit. It's just another general chosen one story arc, and Po happens to be the one at the center of this story. But I will say as a plus point for the film that the animation here is absolutely beautiful, and the stylistic choices that the animators made here is really commendable because it very much goes along with the Chinese traditional art, and it just looks stunning and very distinctive in the pool of DreamWorks films that we're talking about. Now we're reaching the top 5 DreamWorks films that I absolutely love, and at number 5 we have Shrek the Third. Now this might be a huge surprise to many of you, and some of you might even be disgusted, but I love Shrek the Third. Oh my god, this is easily my most watched Shrek movie out of all of them. In fact, it might even be my most watched DreamWorks movie. I think it explores a really interesting part of Shrek's story where he's settled down with Fiona and everything is fine and dandy until he gets this huge pile of responsibility that's just thrown onto his lap and he has to deal with it. And he deals with it in a very Shrek way, which is basically running away from his problems and enlisting a child, a teenager, to be responsible for the entire kingdom. And this teenager is this world's version of King Arthur, and the first time I saw this film I was like, oh, so that's how they're going to introduce King Arthur. Nope. Spoiler alert, he doesn't become king. And I believe that this is also the first film that we're introduced to Merlin, who is again just a fantastic the characterizations of these characters from mythology and from lore and legends and fairy tales is just brilliant. It's so good in this franchise. Because the mythology is so extensive, there's really no end point. Like, you could have had spin-offs of each of these different characters and it would have worked really, really well because there's so much to draw upon. Unfortunately, that's not the direction that the franchise decided to go in, and unlike Penguins of Madagascar, its spin-offs weren't quite as successful. But still, I think each of these characters were just so interesting, and I think they did a great job of building not just the world of Far, Far Away, but also these side characters that are more than just filling screen time. They're shining in their own right. At number 4 we have Rise of the Guardians. Now talk about an underrated film. This film was so under the radar, and unfortunately it didn't do well at the box office either, but I've always loved this film. It's always had a very special place in my heart. I love the concept of having Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny and the Tooth Fairy all working together in this little team to get people believing in them again. I also really enjoyed the characterizations of these characters from folklore, especially in the case of Santa Claus, who they reimagined as this really huge Russian guy who has all of these tattoos and a really thick accent, but at the same time he still has a heart of gold and still loves what he does and has an affection for bringing joy and happiness throughout the world. And another favorite here is the Easter Bunny, who is again just the complete antithesis of the type of character that you would expect the Easter Bunny to be. He's not fluffy and cute and adorable. He is Australian. Well, is he Australian? He's from like Easter Island or somewhere, and he's very much a badass character who takes his job very seriously, and he has this cool rivalry between him and Santa Claus. So yeah, I love the characterizations and I love the dynamics between the team members here. I think it's really great, and I liked following the story of Jack Frost. It's actually a pretty sad story for a DreamWorks film at least, and I think the character of Jack Frost was a really cool looking glass into the world that they're building and a cool character to follow along this journey. And I also think that the boogeyman, who's the villain of this story, is legitimately frightening. Like, he has this really cool aesthetic to him that is just so dark, but it's kind of like an ombre effect as well, where he just looks a bit out of sorts, and it's a really cool character design, and I think it really works in terms of creating a bit more of a frightening character for kids to actually be afraid of. If there's any criticism that I'd give this film is that, you know, having watched it relatively recently, perhaps it's not as amazing as I remembered it, and I think that's the case for a lot of these films, is that there are definitely going to be flaws that I can recognize if I rewatch all of them, which I probably should have done for this review, but I don't have time. I did watch this during Christmas, and I did think that the storyline with the kids was a little bit weak, and the character designs of these kids were also very bizarre. As my brothers pointed out, they looked like adults in little kid bodies. It was pretty weird. I don't think the animation holds up as well as some of these other films, but I do think it's a very endearing story. I think it's a really good Christmas story as well, or Easter story. And I think the character designs for this film were very beautiful. If you look at the effects of Jack Frost's actual frost and the Sandman's sand and the Tooth Fairy's little creatures, like, they're very beautiful to look at. It's an aesthetically pleasing film, unless we're talking about those human kids. They were ugly. They were freaky. It was uncanny valley all the way. Okay, so now we're going from a very underrated film to a much beloved franchise, and at number 3 we have How to Train Your Dragon 2. I'm not going to discuss this film in any amount of detail because, spoiler alert, we will be seeing the addition of another How to Train Your Dragon film on this list, and we'll go into more detail there. But like I said, the How to Train Your Dragon franchise is an incredibly successful franchise for DreamWorks, and I happen to think that it's one of the most consistent franchises, consistent trilogies especially, ever made, because all of these films are so good. And even though How to Train Your Dragon 3 doesn't make an appearance in this list, I still very much enjoyed that film. I think it was a great way to wrap up the entire franchise, and again, the quality doesn't drop when it comes to this franchise. It still remains relatively consistent. I think the weak point across the board is definitely the villains of these stories. They're never memorable, they never stand out to me. But when it comes to the characters, when it comes to their dynamic with one another and the beautiful relationship that they have between the humans and the dragons, oh, it's untouchable. Like, it's just completely incomparable. This franchise just shines when it comes to that aspect. It's just that the antagonists never really measure up to the charisma and the memorability of the characters of Berk. Also, specifically speaking about How to Train Your Dragon 2, I will say that it has one of the saddest moments in all of these DreamWorks films. I remember crying in the cinema when Hiccup's dad died. It was so sad. I also very much enjoyed the introduction of Hiccup's mother in this film. I think that was a great twist, although that was spoiled in the trailers, unfortunately. By the way, the trailers for a lot of these films, not great. Definitely reminiscent of Nicole Kidman's character in Aquaman, actually, if you look back at it. But I was definitely so upset to see Hiccup's dad go. I think he was a great character as well. Definitely swapped one parent for the other, because these protagonists can never have both parents being alive and well. That's kind of the Disney formula. But anyways, I think this film is an excellent little midway stop into the story of Hiccup and Toothless and the characters of Berk at large, and I very much enjoyed the fact that the story takes it up a notch. It doesn't just rehash the same thing that the first film did. It actually develops the character of Hiccup and allows him to grow both physically but also as a person, and I think that's what makes these characters so interesting to follow along their journey, because they feel like they're actually moving forward. Okay, so now we're going back to a very underrated film, and at number 2 we have Megamind. Oh my goodness, I'm embarrassed for every single one of you who has not seen Megamind, because this is such a hidden gem. I'm so upset it never got the credit and the money that it deserved at the box office, because it is just mwah, creme de la creme of DreamWorks in my opinion. I love Megamind. I think he's a fantastic character voiced by Will Ferrell. Oh, I think it's one of my favorite, no, it's my very favorite Will Ferrell performance by far. I think he's fantastic here. The character of Megamind definitely reminds me of like a Loki, where he's definitely the bad guy, he's definitely the villain, but he's an anti-villain. Like, you like him. Who doesn't like Megamind? Who cares if he takes over the world? Just let him, he's so cool. And I especially love the antagonistic relationship that he has with Metro Man, who's voiced by Brad Pitt. Again, just excellent casting. Their relationship is very reminiscent of like the Joker and Batman. But at the roots of all of this is a very insecure individual who never felt like he could measure up to Metro Man as a person, and he's definitely overcompensating for that, and it just makes Megamind such an endearing character to follow underneath all of that, you know, bravado and the craziness, and also just the charisma. He is electric. Oh, I love this character so much. I mean, just in general, I love me an anti-hero, but he's up there with Loki in terms of my favorite anti-heroes. And Deadpool, I guess I would add in as well. I also mentioned Megamind in my list of best movies of the decade, spoiler alert, and I also said there that I very much felt like this film was ahead of its time. Oh, if only it had come out a bit later, because in 2010, like, those were the early days of the superhero renaissance that we're experiencing right now. I fully believe that if this film had first of all been marketed better, and secondly been released later on at the peak of the superhero movie renaissance, I think it definitely would have done better, because it kind of plays off of the trope of superhero movies, and in such a funny and intelligent way, with these characters that are again so fantastic to see on screen and very memorable. I think it would have done so much better. And also, side note, I haven't really mentioned it in the rest of this video, but this film also has a very good soundtrack, which a lot of DreamWorks films famously do, and Trolls isn't featured in this video spoiler alert again. But that also has an incredible soundtrack. It's very like basic jukeboxy musical type situation, but I very much enjoyed it whilst watching the film. And actually thinking about it, a lot of these times these DreamWorks films don't have the strongest scores, but some of their soundtracks really stand out. And finally, we've reached number one, the very best DreamWorks film in my opinion, and that is of course How to Train Your Dragon, the first one. Like I said before, the How to Train Your Dragon franchise is one of the most successful franchises that DreamWorks has ever had, that animation has ever seen, both financially but also in terms of its quality, because this trilogy was just so consistently good. But that is of course all rooted in the fact that the foundation for the trilogy, the very first film, was absolutely breathtakingly amazing. Now all three of these films were directed by the director of Lilo and Stitch, and I'll put his name over here, but you can definitely see the similarities between the character of Stitch and the character of Toothless. When I discovered this, I was like, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense now. But both of those characters are so endearing, so lovable, and they act as an amazing emotional core to this franchise. And of course, the character of Toothless is first introduced in the first film, as is Hiccup, and both of them just have such an incredible emotional connection between them. Oh, it's just stunning. It's beautiful to see those characters grow and to see their introduction in this film. I love Toothless and Hiccup. I think they're amazing. Again, one of the most memorable characters in animation in general, and I think DreamWorks did an excellent job of building the foundation here. And what has always struck me as incredible about this film as well is that at the very end, Hiccup goes through a traumatic experience where he loses his leg, and that actually holds true throughout the entire franchise. So his leg doesn't magically grow back, or he doesn't get fixed up, or it's something that he has to deal with as a consequence of what happened. And it feels like just the realest stakes that we could ever see in any animated film. And it's just so profound to me in this film, because it really says a lot about the character of Hiccup, and it says a lot about the nature of this franchise, where it doesn't magically erase something as traumatic as losing a limb, and actually deals with that. And Hiccup is actually able to use his intelligence and his ingenuity to actually solve the shortcomings that he has as a result of the loss of his leg. But it is such an interesting insight into a very different type of character that we don't often see represented in film in general, but specifically in animation, which is a character with a disability. And finally, we also have some really cool side characters here. Like I said, I really liked Hiccup's dad. His friends as well are really funny and enjoyable to watch, although I will say that their shtick gets a bit stale as the films go along. They don't seem to develop as characters as much as Hiccup and Toothless do in these films. In the first film, they're definitely likable, and they definitely work well to fill out the world of Berk. And I also very much enjoyed the other dragons, and I like the fact that this series very much gives them their own personalities, which again are very grounded in dog-like characteristics, but still they seem to have their own personalities depending on the different species, and they connect with different humans in different ways. It's pretty cool how they build the whole world up, and I like the fact that again, as we go through these films, we see how these humans and dragons' lives get integrated, at least until the very end when they all disappear off into their own hidden worlds. So that's it from me. Now that I've told you guys my top 10 list of the best DreamWorks films, it's time for you guys to let me know what your lists are down in the comments below. Please be sure to subscribe to catch new videos coming up. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!